Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and this subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And for those of you that have been around boxing now for the past several years, once again, as I've already stated, you know that in my personal view that there's been four standouts, at least to the debatable best of this generation. I would say mainly three, especially because when you talk about this generation, I believe that this generation is going to be ended with the Canelo, Usyk, and Crawford era, in my personal view. And of course, there is also a debate about who is right now possibly the number one pound for pound fighter. Now, of course, you have a certain amount of people saying that Terence Bud Crawford is the undisputed number one pound for pound fighter. And of course, if you have him as the number one pound for pound, in my personal view, that's a great debate. At the end of the day, the man has been undisputed in two separate weight classes. And on top of that, Terence Bud Crawford, he is an exemplary fighter. He has a great skill set. Now, of course, his last fight against Israel Madrimov, someone who only had about 11 total fights, in my view, it was a little bit too close for someone that should be, quote unquote, the undisputed number one pound per pound fighter. But of course, I don't really have him as my complete undisputed number one pound per pound fighter because I think that Usyk is right there with him. And in my personal view, especially after that victory that he got over Tyson Fury, I would probably have to have Usyk as my number one pound per pound fighter, just because my pound per pound list is mainly based off of who, in my view, got the biggest win of that year, at least a lot of the times, or at least, the biggest win in most recent years. And I think that Tyson Fury win that Usyk was able to get, and on top of that, his skill set, I think that is very comparable with that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But of course, if you had Crawford, up there as the number one pound per pound fighter, it's very debatable as well. But of course, another fighter that, of course, has been in recent conversations as the debatable number one pound per pound fighter has been that of Mr. Naoya Inoue, that of the Japanese monster. Now, in my personal view, I don't think that Inoue has ever necessarily been the number one pound per pound fighter because, in my personal view, I don't think that he quite has the resume as of yet. He is also another very talented and exemplary skilled fighter, but Inoue, in my personal view, unfortunately for him, he is in some weight classes that, in my personal view, don't always have the highest degrees of competition or the highest levels of competition. Now, that being stated, there has been some recent standouts as of late, like that of Junto Nakatani, who is a relatively talented fighter, and of course, Mr. Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, who I think is an unbelievably talented fighter. So we'll see what Inoue is able to do against those fighters. Also, of course, against possibly the 126-pound weight class. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this video is because this guy right here, John Boxing Pound for Pound the Best, who, in my view, at times brings up some good points, but also has a little bit of a bias as well. Of course, he has kind of talked about Naoya in a way as if he is a little bit more fluff and muff than what he actually is reality. At least when you talk about the conversations of him being up there with some of the best. Now, in my view, Inoue is not quite the number one pound for pound fighter quite as of yet. I think that both Usyk and Terence Bud Crawford would be ahead of him. I just don't think that he quite has the resume. But I do think that Inoue is a real deal fighter, and I think that he has proven himself within his career, especially after that victory over that of a Steve Von Coolboy Fulton. And of course, you could debate Lewis Neri and no need to deny in the rematch. And of course, there might be even a couple of other fights that I'm not mentioning as well, but we'll see. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this video is because this video right here, which is a complete hypothetical argument, which in my view shouldn't really be used, at least not completely, to completely win a pound for pound level argument that a lot of the LDBC and new media people love to use, but a lot of boxing fans in general like to use, is that if these two were in the same weight class, we all know who would end up winning that fight. And the reason why I don't really like to use that argument is because we're never really going to know the answer to that question. Now, of course, we can take a look at, certain fighters and we can say, okay, more than likely if those two are in the same weight class, maybe we would know if this fighter would win. But how do we really know if that fighter would actually win? And of course, what John Boxing is going to state is that Terence Bud Crawford, that if he was in the same weight class as a Naoya Inoue, that more than likely that Crawford would beat that of it Inoue, and that's just common sense. And that's a part of the reason as to why Crawford should be over Inoue on a pound for pound list. But a lot of this is based off of certain people trying to state that Terence Bud Crawford, that his dominance and his skill set is so far ahead of everybody else's. And in my personal view, it's just not. And a lot of the LDBC and new media channels, they try to make Terence Bud Crawford into something that he isn't, which is a Floyd Mayweather Jr. like figure. And Crawford, in my view, is an all-time great fighter. He's debatably one of the top 20 greatest fighters that I've ever seen in the history of boxing. I'm not really quite sure if I can place him within my top 10 just because of the lack of resume compared to other all-time great fighters, but he definitely is in the conversation. I think that Terence Bud Crawford deserves a lot of great acclaim, but Terence Bud Crawford is not someone that is this Floyd Mayweather Jr. type of figure, to where Floyd Mayweather Jr. not only has a great resume, an all-time great resume, debatably the greatest resume within that of modern boxing history, but also when you talk about it, Floyd Mayweather Jr. has several performances over A-grade level fighters, or even over pound-for-pound fighters that would have been looked at as pound-for-pound at the time, and completely dominated them within that match. People keep trying to act like Terence Bud Crawford, that it's just him and anyone else in boxing, and that Terence Bud Crawford, that his skill set is so far and ahead of everybody else's. When in fact, when you talk about it, Terence Bud Crawford, people forget that in that first fight against Yuriorkis Gamboa, by the way, where Gamboa had a year layoff, which, a lot of people love to bring up with Lomachenko, or another fighter when he fought someone like Guillermo Rigondeaux, but they won't bring it up when Crawford fought that of a Yuriorkis Gamboa or an Errol Spence Jr. So if we're going to keep those standards, no problem, but keep them along the same lines. Terence Bud Crawford was receiving that work from Yuriorkis Gamboa, someone that was probably about 1.5 to 2 weight classes smaller than him, to be honest with you, someone who never should have been in 135 pounds in the first place. Crawford was losing the first half of that fight against Yuriorkis Gamboa. People seem to forget that. Then, of course, when you talk about his fight against Aegis Kavaliauskas, Mean Machine, he actually got hurt very badly in that fight, and it should have been counted as a knockdown when he landed that right hand on Crawford, and Crawford went in the clinch, and he went down willingly, by the way, and took a knee. It should have been counted as a knockdown, in my personal view. He was losing a certain amount of rounds in that fight against Sean Showtime Porter. He was losing a certain amount of the rounds in the first half of that fight. He was losing rounds against Kell Brook, in the first part of that fight. He was losing the first 2 rounds against a complete washed-up Kell Brook. He was losing rounds against a Jose Benavidez who was shot in the leg and was never really quite the same fighter again after he had that leg injury. So people keep, I don't know why, but people keep trying to act like Terence Bud Crawford is this guy to where his defense is impenetrable, and that Terence Bud Crawford, that he is just more dominant than everybody else. But to be quite honest with you, that just hasn't been the case. At the end of the day, you can see a certain amount of fights where Crawford has had a certain amount of very tough fights with that of many fighters. And of course, this happens with many all-time great fighters. We've seen it a little bit with Usyk. We've seen it, of course, with Inoue. It isn't like Inoue has never had a tough fight. He had a very tough fight with an older an older Donaire in the first fight. Of course, he avenged it in the rematch. Of course, he had a very tough fight in the first couple rounds, I believe, against the Lewis Neri. He got knocked down in the first round, I believe, in his most recent fight against the Irish former champion, TJ Doheny. He had a very tough outing against TJ Doheny. And of course, I'm sure there's a couple of other fights that I'm not mentioning. But once again, this thing about Terence Bud Crawford and his skill set just being way far and ahead of everybody else's. I mean, if you want to debate that Terence Bud Crawford is more skilled than Inoue, or more skilled, than a certain amount of these other fighters, I can't necessarily disagree with that, because Crawford has showed time and time again that he's a great fighter. But at the end of the day, I just can't agree with this notion that Terence Bud Crawford is so much more dominant and so far and ahead of everybody else. It seems like a certain amount of people seem to forget that Crawford has had a certain amount of troubling fights as well, and to be quite honest with you, not even over the greatest level of competition. So it is what it is. And of course, let's not forget his most recent fight against a Uzbekistani fighter who has never fought a great fighter before, who only had 11 fights, and Crawford had a 7 rounds to 5 fight with him. Now, of course, to be fair, Crawford was moving up in weight for the first time at 154, and of course, the man's about 37 years old. So, of course, one could acclaim it to that. But other than Errol Spence Jr. and Victor Postal, what other performances against really good competition has Terence Bud Crawford really had to where you were just like, wow, that was truly an exemplary performance, like what Floyd did against Diego Corrales, or Ricky Hatton, or Canelo Alvarez, or Sugar Shane Mosley? It's not going to happen, at least not as often, because when you talk about his pound-for-pound level fights, or the 5 A-grade level fights that he has had, Gamboa, at the end of the day, he was struggling within that fight. Sean Porter, he was struggling within that fight. Israel Madrimov, he was struggling within that fight. So it is what it is. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what the man has to say.
Going back to my original criteria, if we put them in the same hypothetical universe where they're the same size and they fight, who kicks whose ass? I think Crawford kicks Inoue's ass. I think his style is very, very difficult to deal with. He's like an alien out there, the way that he fights for both positions. And yes, Inoue is very, very fundamental.
Common sense. This is why Crawford is the #1 pound for pound fighter. Common sense. I do understand that there are some people.
Well, when we talk about, once again, if these two were in the same weight class and somehow acclimated it, I'm not really quite sure who would potentially win this fight. I would say that Crawford maybe, in terms of the skill set, maybe would get the slight advantage over Inoue. I would say that his head movement and his movement is a little bit better. But when you talk about it in terms of athleticism, and Crawford is a great athlete, all-time great athlete, Inoue might debatably be the best athlete on the planet when you talk about it in terms of being a boxer. Now, Gervonta Tank Davis is up there as well, and I'm sure that there's a couple of other, debates up there that I'm not thinking of. But in a way, when you talk about his level of power and speed, his level of power and speed are probably even greater than that of a Terence Bud Crawford's. So it is what it is. Now, defensively, I would say that both of these fighters, and in my view, that they're very good defensively on average, but I'm going to really say that they're, Floyd Mayweather Jr., esque and when it comes to their defense. Crawford gets hit quite a bit, at least in certain fights. He got hit quite a bit against Madrimov. He got hit a little bit against Kell Brook. He got hit quite a bit against Yuriorkis Gamboa. He got hit quite a bit against Sean Porter. You can see a couple of times where he was stunned back in that fight. And Crawford is not this guy that has this Floyd Mayweather Jr. type of defense. He never has. Now, he can be very good, and against Errol Spence Jr., he was great defensively, but other than that, Terence Bud Crawford is not this defensive master. He never has been. And in a way, I kind of have to say the same thing. I think that his defense is relatively good, and of course, when he really wants to show out, like against Steve on Coolboy Fulton, his defense and, of course, his head movement massively improved. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't really say that his defense is Floyd Mayweather Jr.-esque or something that is like a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, to where his defense overall is just super exemplary. When you want to talk about the best defensive fighter of this era, or on the pound-for-pound list, in my personal view, actually, that either goes to a Canelo Alvarez, at least during his peak years, because right now, of course, he clearly has lost a step or two, or even debatably Alexander Usyk. Now, Usyk, in my personal view, does not always defend super well to the body, but in my view, he does defend better to the head than that of an Inoue or a Crawford.
That would rather have someone that doesn't look like Terence Crawford presented as being the #1 fighter in the sport. I understand that clearly. However, there's a lot of fans that do have common sense. And a lot of people, they get mad at boxing.
Right, but why is it really quote-unquote common sense that if these two were in the same weight class, Terence Bud Crawford would really beat Inoue? Once again, this dude is acting like Terence Bud Crawford has just never had a tough fight in his career. At the end of the day, once again, Terence Bud Crawford has had tough fights and against subpar level competition. The man had a very tough fight against Aegis Kavalaskas. The man had a very tough fight overall, once again, against, a little bit of Jose Benavidez in that fight. He recently just had a very tough fight against Israel Madrimov. Now, in my view, Israel Madrimov is an A-grade level fighter, but he's also a fighter that does not have a great amount of pro experience, and a fighter overall to where, he clearly just does not have that amount of competition on his resume for the fight to really be that close. Now, once again, Crawford is older, so one could attribute it to that, but at the end of the day, one could certainly argue that Crawford should have been more dominant within that fight. Also, take a look at when he fought Kell Brook, who, by the way, was pretty much done at that point. The first couple rounds of that fight, Kell Brook was winning that fight. He was actually outboxing Terence Bud Crawford.
Fans who say that Crawford is the number.
So once again, if you want to claim that Crawford beats Inoue, if these guys are in the same weight class, and go off of that hypothetical, you can do that if you want to. But once again, this is the reason why I don't go off of that hypothetical, because that's all it is a hypothetical. And once again, people keep trying to act like Terence Bud Crawford is this Floyd Mayweather Jr. type of fighter, and he's not. When you take a look at Floyd Mayweather Jr. once again, and once again, that's not to imply that Crawford is not great in his own right. But Floyd Mayweather Jr., when you talk about when he beat Sugar Shane Mosley, Mosley was ranked top 10 pound per pound. And other than the first two rounds, Floyd Mayweather Jr. pretty much whooped Shane Mosley's ass after that. Of course, he pretty much whooped up on Canelo Alvarez when Canelo was looked at as top 10 pound per pound. Maybe not at his absolute peak quite as of yet, but, still in his prime years and still a top 10 level pound per pound fighter. Diego Corrales, of course, when he pretty much beat him up in that fight and ended up knocking him out, I believe, within that of the 10th or the 11th round, one of those rounds. And of course, there's some other fighters that perhaps I'm not thinking of. Juan Manuel Marquez, Ricky Hatton, of course, maybe some other fighters that I'm not thinking of. It's not like Crawford has had this many dominant performances, even in some of his bigger fights. Now, once again, against Errol Spence Jr., he was phenomenal. But if we talk about the biggest fights of these guys' careers, now, one, of course, could debate that Spence is better than that of Steven Fulton if you want to, but, you know, Errol Spence also in that fight against Crawford, even though, of course, I still think Spence was, you know, still at a very great point in his career, one could debate that Spence is a little bit harder, or excuse me, a little bit easier overall for a style like a Crawford to defeat because of his movement overall and his boxing ability than what that of a Fulton would be for an Inoue, because he fights a little bit more slicker and, of course, with a little bit more rhythm. Errol Spence is a type of guy to where, even though he can box and he definitely has great boxing ability, he's a guy to where, you know, he kind of has to bully his opponent a little bit or punish them. And usually if he does not do that, he is not going to be overtly successful. But that being stated, you know, I'm not going to go quite that far because Errol Spence Jr., in my view, would have been higher on the pound-for-pound list. You know, but once again, the fact remains that in the biggest fight of their careers, when it was looked at as 50-50, these guys were pretty much just as dominant over their opponent as the other guy. Crawford was just as dominant over Spence as what Inoue was over Fulton.
One fighter in the
But once again, I would state that Spence is a greater fighter than that of Steven Coolboy Fulton.
sport. They say, oh, you're only picking Crawford because he's XYZ. But meanwhile, you know, these people that say that garbage are only going against Crawford because he's XYZ. There's about 4 fighters that are on the pound-for-pound list that I think that if they were the same size as Naoya Inoue, they will also kick Naoya Inoue's butt. Oh, John Boxing, Stephen Fulton. Well, Stephen Fulton, he represents that boxer style. But Stephen Fulton, he got comfortable.
Right, but when we talk about the pound-for-pound list, we could also debate this about Crawford potentially losing some fights. Are we completely sure that Crawford would beat Alexander Usyk if they were in the same weight class? Are we quite sure that if Terence Bud Crawford and Gervonta Tank Davis were in the absolute same weight class, that he would beat either Shakur Stevenson or that of a Gervonta Tank Davis? Are we completely sure about that? So once again, that's why I say that, you know, we can't always go off of this hypothetical.
But once he found out that he could fight in the inside, when he fought Angelo Leo, he didn't outbox Angelo Leo. He actually fought Angelo Leo. And he got comfortable with fighting, you know, fighters on the inside. He did that with Brandon Figueroa, and he tried it with Monster Inoue. I think Stephen Fulton, you know, got away from himself, his original self, the moment that he learned that he could fight in the inside.
No, dude, he really didn't get away from shit. The thing that happened is that Inoue was a lot more maneuverable, also a lot more fast and a lot more skilled. And once he felt that power, which he knew was going to be there, but once Inoue proved to be a lot more smarter than what he thought he was, and he felt that power, he said, shit, I cannot outdo this guy. And he says, this dude's power is for real, and I can feel it with every single punch.
And that cost him against Monster Inoue. Do I think he could beat Monster Inoue? Yes, and then no.
No, he can't. Because if Steven Coolboy Fulton could beat Monster Inoue, he would have won even a single round against Monster Inoue in that first fight. Steven Fulton was completely outperformed in that first fight. Completely outperformed.
I think with the right.
And you don't get completely outperformed like that and stopped within 8 rounds if you could potentially beat your opponent. Now, maybe had Fulton sat down on his punches and actually tried to throw it in a way, then maybe. But in my view, it would not have worked anyways because Inoue was too slick and more skilled than even what I had thought he was going to be within that fight. And once Fulton realized that Inoue had actual great slick boxing ability, he knew that it pretty much was over. That's why he barely threw any punches throughout that fight, because he knew that he could not compete with his athleticism.
Game plan and being able to fight a perfect fight against Inoue. But I just think Inoue is just simply better than Stephen Fulton because it showed in the fight. He was just simply better. But however, Inoue being the #1 pound-for-pound fighter is basically lying to the public. He's not the best.
Well, you could debate Inoue as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, just like you could debate years ago that Crawford was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. But in my personal view, it's just not his time yet. In my personal view, it's either Usyk or Crawford, because when you combine the whole package, but especially the resume, I would have to put Crawford and Usyk's resume a little bit over Naoya Inoue's.
Fighter in the sport, Terence Crawford is. And my personal opinion, I think The only fighter that's on the pound for pound list that can come close or actually beat Terence Crawford is Alexander Usyk. A lot of people has
Well, there's possible multiple fighters to where if they were in the same weight class once again, you could debate that maybe that fighter would debate would beat the other, but once again, all that is a hypothetical and that's not really ever going to be proven anyway. So all that pretty much is a bunch of, is a bunch of, wash when it comes down to this, pretty much a moot point. Now of course we can take a look at certain fighters, through that of certain weight classes and say, oh, okay, this fighter has that ability, this fighter doesn't. So we can kind of allege that, but at the end of the day, with Inoue's level of power and speed, how do we know that he would not potentially knock Terence Bud Crawford out if they were within the same weight class? We don't know that for sure. So that's why I say we cannot go completely off of that hypothetical. But of course, we do have to go off of skill set and dominance, and we also do have to go off of accomplishments and that of dominance, and of course that of the resume as well. And the thing is about Inoue and Crawford is that these two, to be quite honest with you, that their careers are actually very, very similar. Now, I would say that Crawford is overall probably the slightly more skilled fighter, but to be quite honest with you, it's relatively close. I think Inoue is a little bit more skilled than what some people give him credit for. And on top of that, when you talk about it, about who is more dominant, you could debate that Inoue has been a little bit more dominant throughout his career. But of course, that being stated, Inoue, in my view, has the lesser resume of the two fighters.
really notice that Alexander Usyk's style is not your typical Eastern European style. Alexander Usyk, he kind of blend two styles together. He has the quote-unquote slick Black American style mixed with the mixture of the Eastern European style. If you
I agree.
look at the way Alexander Usyk fight, he fights like your typical slick Black American fighter. He downloads information, and then once he's able to figure a fighter out, he completely takes over. He's light on his feet.
When you talk about Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, and Terence Bud Crawford, all phenomenal fighters. At the very least, all those fighters are within my top 30 fighters of all time. And you could debate any single one of those fighters, in my personal view, debatably within the top 10 fighters of all time. In my personal view, wherever you rank Evander Holyfield on your all-time great list, or James Toney, or someone like that, Alexander Usyk has to be slightly ahead of them, in my view, or he has to be ahead of them. When you talk about Terence Bud Crawford, and that of a Canelo Alvarez, they're above certain fighters like Oscar De La Hoya, in my personal view. They're above Miguel Cotto. They're above Sugar Shane Mosley. They're above Juan Manuel Marquez, Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric Morales. That's where those fighters lie. So, in my personal view, any one of those fighters, you could debate within maybe the bottom 5 of the top 10 of all time, but certainly within, the debate of the top 20 and the top 30 fighters of all time. Because Alexander Usyk, now in my personal view, has to be regarded as the greatest cruiserweight probably of all time, and certainly the greatest cruiserweight that ever moved up to heavyweight.
Decent speed.
Or at least had the most amount of success at heavyweight.
And he doesn't load up on a bunch of shots like Mexican fighters do. He kind of pegs and pokes, and then when he's able to land flush on you, then he starts sitting down on his punches, kind of like what Floyd Mayweather Jr. used to do. And similar to what Terence doesn't load up on a bunch, and once he's able to figure a fighter out, he completely takes over. He's light on his feet, decent speed, and he doesn't load up on a bunch of shots like Mexican fighters do. He kind of pegs and pokes, and then when he's able to land flush on you, then he starts sitting down on his punches, kind of like what Floyd Mayweather Jr. used to do. And similar to what Terence Crawford do. Alexander Usyk has a style that cannot be mimicked. And this is why I say, if him and Crawford were the same size, he's probably the only fighter.
Well, I'm not going to state that Alexander Usyk doesn't have a style that can't be quote-unquote mimicked. But I think what the better thing would be to say, excuse me, in my personal view, is that Alexander Usyk and Terence Bud Crawford, and also Inoue and Canelo Alvarez, certain fighters like these, they have a full package, both mentally and physically, that cannot be completely mimicked or copied, or you cannot completely replicate what they do. You have to have the full package. And all those fighters, in my view, have, if they don't have the complete full package, they have pretty damn close to it.
On that pound for pound list that will either come close to beating Crawford or actually beat Terence Crawford. But in no way, absolutely not.
Well, once again, I'm not going to say
at G5.
I'm not going to say absolutely not for Mr. Monster Inoue, because Inoue, in my view, is a greatly skilled fighter. and he has gotten better pretty much within every single fight. So let's not detract from Inoue here. Now, of course, in my view, Inoue is not within a weight class that has the most amount of great contenders. But at the end of the day, Inoue is a relatively decently skilled fighter. And of course, his athleticism is off the charts. So I'm not going to sit here and state that, Inoue is not even close to Terence Bud Crawford. In my view, that wouldn't be quite right. Now, I would say that Crawford may be a slightly more skilled than Inoue, but to be quite honest with you, even that is a little bit debatable because, once again, take a look at Crawford in some of the fights in his career. It's not like Crawford has a completely spotless, overall performance, throughout every single fight either. So it is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. I thought it was very particularly interesting because a lot of these channels or a certain amount of Crawford fans, they keep trying to make him into something that he is not. And he is not Floyd Mayweather Jr. He is not someone that has just had a lot of flawless or super dominant performances over a lot of these top pound-for-pound fighters. And even when you talk about some of the bigger fights, he had a very troubling time against Sean Porter. He had a very troubling time against Yuriorkis Gamboa, and he had hell against out of Israel Madrimov. He had hell against the first couple rounds against the washed-up Kell Brook. He had a little bit of hell against Aegis Kavalauskas. He had a little bit of trouble against Jose Benavidez. And there's even some other fights that I'm sure I could point out that I'm not thinking of at the moment. But of course, that being stated, what makes Crawford great is not only his great skill set, but whenever he needed to turn it up, he did, and he has great adaptability and great skills. But once again, let's not sit here and try to pretend like Crawford overall is just super dominant in every single fight and that he's never showed any flaws, because that's just not the case. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.